Well, hi, everyone. I know some of you and I don't know some of you, so welcome either way. My name is Emily Major, and I just finished my PhD in human animal studies. And this is so the presentation today looks at a paper, my very first paper I did outside of my PhD, that was called Slayers, Rippers, and Blitzes. And though it didn't directly interrogate capitalism, there was a lot of overlap with the discussion. So today I'm hoping to go over that and kind of discuss how capitalism, especially with possums in New Zealand, is kind of very intertwined. So very generically, I will go over one of my articles that I've written, and then kind of discuss a little bit more about media ethics and what this has to do with capitalism as well as speciesism. For some of you that don't know me, I'm a very proud rat mom, a vegan academic activist. My background kind of has to do with critical animal studies, intersectional feminism, media studies, vegan sociology now. I have kind of a wide range of interests, but what my current projects and interests are looking at primarily have to do with compassion and empathy and how that relates to demonized or ostracized species in society, so such as rats, pigeons, and my biggest project that I've done, which is my PhD, looked at brush-tailed possums, which are considered pests in New Zealand, despite being endangered in Australia, which is where they're from. So kind of to quickly go over the article that I wrote, essentially it had to do with examining media. And I was very curious how possums were being framed in the New Zealand media, primarily because they are considered a pest. And I was very curious to map it post what's called Predator-Free 2050. So Predator-Free 2050 was, it is a governmental campaign that seeks to reduce and completely eradicate all rats, possums, and stoats in New Zealand by the year 2050. And that was released in 2016, and it's still something that is worked towards today. And I was really curious how the media would kind of grapple with this. And so essentially it was a qualitative thematic analysis paper where I looked at three key things. So the first filter of trying to figure out what articles were relevant or not was considering what ones had the word possum in the title. If they were published between 2016 and 2023, because that was the end of when I was gathering my data, and written by one of the 8 key publishers and top publishers that we have here in New Zealand. And so I did a lot of reading, and some of it was more depressing than others. I ended up looking over 327 news articles, but I kind of whittled it down and got to 148 news articles, which I wanted to examine. And the publishers ranged from national news sites to Radio New Zealand, which is a broadcaster, but also does print work, international and regional, so rural news as well. And this was actually inspired by a similar project that some of you may have heard of if you know about possums. It basically did a similar, it was a similar project, but before Predator-Free 2050 was revealed. And so what we ended up finding, or what they ended up finding, was that possums were framed in particular ways in the media. And that was, there's three key findings that McCrow-Young al. found. And the first thing was that we saw militant language being used, where there's a war on possums. It's patriotic Kiwis versus possums. We saw a lot of discussion around the economy, objectification, desensitization, and speciesism. And so these authors argued that the media can frame possums in ways that marginalize them, as well as allowing scapegoating. Now, what ends up happening, I mean, there's lots of things to cover in 15 minutes, but there's an oversimplification of what being is considered good and what being is considered bad. And we see this play out in the media. And even if you look over the course of the next few slides. I'm just showing some examples. So this one was the inspiration of what kind of gave me the idea to do this. So you can kind of see, and if you just look at the title, if you look at the images being used, and even some of the wording that you see here, like with this one, New Zealand is winning its battle against the pesky possum. And so it's interesting when we interrogate the media and we consider what the purpose of the media is, particularly media in New Zealand where possums are considered pests, and that's pretty much the only narrative you hear. So as a result of my project, I found that possums were overwhelmingly presented negatively. And this was especially in more rural news sites, particularly the Otago Daily Times, because that's in a very remote part of New Zealand in the south. And only a few articles actually spoke positively about possums. And so I actually found the same themes from the previous slide of militancy, discussions of the economy, and objectification, desensitization, and dominance. So that was copied over, but I also found this new theme, which seemed to come through very strongly. And it was a relationship that emerged with dark humor and militant language. So as you're hearing me speak, I'm hoping that over the next few slides, as I mentioned, you just take a look at some of the wording and the language that's being used here, and how the media is really trying to bring readers in through kind of clickbaity titles to try to get people interested in the topic. And for this one particularly, whacking possums. For one newlywed couple, there's no better honeymoon than killing possums in Taranaki. And so the way that the media is presenting these narratives about possums is very deliberate and particular. And it's something that I do criticize later. But I'd like you just to see a few of these examples. This one here, possum is scourge of farm and forest. And so what we see is that the possum is the enemy. They are what is going to destroy not only agriculture, but native species as well. And what is interesting, and something I notice quite frequently, is that at the face value, you see that possums are being framed, or native species are being framed as the reason why we're doing conservation. But once you start actually examining the wording and what the text is actually saying, it's actually about the economy and agriculture, more so than native species. So you'll see the picture of the rock wren, but as you look a little bit further down, the discussion is actually about bovine tuberculosis, because possums are vectors of bovine TB. And so it's all about meat and dairy, which is where capitalism comes in. Now, we did see a lot of militancy, or I saw a lot of militancy in discussion with possums. And look here, so possums are under siege. They're facing a losing battle. And so the wording is very specific and really emphasizes that the importance of getting rid of them. It's creating an us versus them environment. And it does beg the question, how much of this is actually about native species and how much more is about money? Now, I have to warn everybody, some of the pictures in the upcoming slides are a bit upsetting. So the worst one, I'm going to give you a heads up just because it's really awful. But I'd like you just to consider the fact that these images exist, and the fact that these images exist in regular newspapers and online. So you would go to New Zealand Herald, which is a very popular news site, and you would see these images without any warning. And the fact that that's even a thing is of concern here, because how is that's allowed? So what I was incredibly concerned about was this kind of underbelly of dark humor that was emerging. So talking about bagging rabbits and pimping possums. And as you can see in some of the wording, hopefully you can read it, this chilled possum was a crowd pleaser in the best dressed possum competition, despite the odd blowfly. Because what you're seeing here is that in order to justify or downplay the seriousness of killing, humor is being used as a way to make it quote unquote funny. And so these activities where people are participating in fundraisers is seen as a communal activity. It's something that people get together, removing possums and raising money. And there were several articles as well that also looked at invasion. So looking at possums entering people's homes as possums invading. And the crazy thing, at least for this article to me, if you don't know possums that well, you wouldn't necessarily know, but that's a juvenile, that's a young possum just based on the size. They likely were just kicked away from their mom, and we're very confused because this happens a lot with juveniles where they don't really know they kind of don't know danger yet, if that makes sense. And if you look at the wording here, we've got the author stating the sharp-clawed pest and invader. The invader possum was staring at me like I was Satan. A little bit later on in the article, the woman who called police said, would they taser the little bastard? So this is very clearly discussions around who gets to belong in a particular space. Now, I'm sorry for this image here. This one was quite polarizing. People thought, well, they first criticized Auckland transport, the fact that a dead possum had clearly been hit by a car was run over and painted over. And the absolute disdain that you would have for a possum to not even move them over. They're dead on the side of the road. And you kind of see two different responses to this. So one is that it's funny, that's hilarious, they're not doing their job. How Kiwi is that? Versus people who thought that this was actually like a sign of something much more. And this just, to me, is the perfect embodiment of how much New Zealanders, just for the most part, if you're a mainstream conservationist, just don't care about possums. And I also thought it was interesting that we have these narratives here as well about possum slayer, and a few of them just reference blitzes as well as rippers in regards to possums. Now, Paula is the former deputy prime minister, and I thought it was really interesting that her trapping a possum on her property was considered kind of like female empowerment, that by her killing a possum that was invading her property, it was something that was actually seen as a good thing and something that made her, well, also presented as funny, making a great hat. Now, this is the image. The next one, close your eyes and I'll let you know when it's over. The fact that this image was on the front page of a newspaper is absolutely appalling, but it also shows you exactly what it's like if you're this kind of species, unfortunately. And this is where that image comes up here. Now, please close your eyes. This is awful. This image honestly made me go insane. But the fact that this is an image that you can use in discussion about possum as resources is very concerning. Now the image is over. So what I was really arguing is that we need to have a new media ethics. So the fact that that exists, we need to kind of step that back. And what I was hoping to argue was that this use of dark humor can justify cruelty to possums, and that we need a new media practice that's intersectional and anti-speciesist. And this is necessary because people are consumers of media. We want people to be able to consume media in ways that make them empowered as well. But it's also doing this in ways that considers that these oppressions are connected. Now, what does this have to do with capitalism? I feel like, okay, I'm checking the time. So capitalism and conservation, especially in New Zealand, there is a really interesting theme going on here where capitalism, especially with possums, you have on the one hand, you want to completely get rid of them, but not on the other, they're actually used as an important resource here. So this really comes into a discussion about how much do you actually want to get rid of possums if they are considered a valuable resource. And there are companies that call them fluffy gold. There's companies that actually argue that possum fur is considered cruelty-free, not for the possums, of course, but for native birds. Then there's also this discussion about marketing something as quote unquote inhumane, marketing something as humane can legitimize animal exploitation. And we've got these discussions kind of happening all amidst wanting to get rid of possums, but also using their bodies within the capitalist system. And so that's where this demonization of cuteness, particularly with brush-tailed possums, is really intriguing for me to try to interrogate. And so, oh, and there's also, unfortunately, okay, got 1 minute. There's also, unfortunately, the use of possum meat for dog food rules. And those are being framed as a really good way for pet owners and companion animal carers to feed their pet while saving native species at the same time. And so everything's really set up to really kind of present possums as the perfect scapegoat. And then it becomes more interesting when you consider that Aurelian, which is the company that manufactures 1080, which is a poison used to kill possums, is actually government owned. And the Minister for Biosecurity and the Minister for Finance are actually shareholders of the company. And so there's actually a lot more going on in the background about why we're not pursuing other methods of pest control, particularly if the government is getting a cut. Now, capitalism can underpins and justifies the widespread killing of possums. And this is where we're really thinking that, okay, so if capitalism is to produce, and to exploit, well, how does that fit with conservation and with possums particularly? Because it wasn't that long ago that people were using possums, like in the 80s, they put possums into the Coromandel to farm them for fur. And so that's where today, this is a very, very brief overview, and I feel like I might have overwhelmed you with some of the discussions, but it's really interesting, and this is an area that warrants more investigation because possum fur and meat is big business, and these companies are government owned, and basically we need more intersectional research to look into this, and we need academic activism, and we need just activism in general. I think I rushed the end there, but I just wanted to make sure I didn't cut into anybody else's time. But if you have any questions, my email's just at the front there, and I would love to hear from you.
So hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm really enjoying the conference. It's been so interesting so far. I'm not going to go into the literature in too much detail today. I know you all know it so well. I just want to make 2 points, the 2 main things I'm taking from the literature. First of all, I'm really inspired by all the work in critical animal and media studies, and in particular this point that the media representations of non-human animals are entangled with wider issues of power in society. And the second point that I just want to make at this stage is that while animals feature everywhere as cultural symbols, real animals' selves, their lives, their experiences, and their suffering tend to remain invisible in the mass media. So that's what I've learned from the literature, and therefore I was quite struck by the fact that in the summer of 2022, I noticed a significant media debate in Ireland about the individual experiences, the sentience, and the potential suffering of one particular animal. So I thought that was interesting. And I looked into it a little bit more. So the animal in question is a wild goat in Ireland, or a wild living goat. So like the possums in New Zealand, wild goats in Ireland are not native. So they're technically feral animals that have been either released from farming or escaped in the past. And for the last few hundred years, they've been living in small groups in the most remote parts of the country. So what I want to look at today is the media debate around what happens with a particular animal at a rural Irish festival, Puck Fair, which is it's a popular 3-day festival held in August every year, and attracts about 100,000 visitors. Puck Fair is held in the small town of Killoughlin in County Kerry in the southwest of Ireland at the very edge of Europe. And it's named after the old Irish word for a male goat, a puck. Puck Fair every year involves a particular ritual where a goat is taken from the wild, it's captured, it's fitted with a crown, it's paraded through the town, and then it's placed in a small metal cage, which is just big enough for it to stand up and lie down again. And this cage is hoisted up onto a 15-meter high stand above a busy market fair where the goat remains for 3 days and 2 nights. And if you look at this image, you can see the fair, and there's a small kind of cage up here at the top, and that's where the goat spends his time, supposedly as king of the fair. Below him is a stage where there's entertainment and music, and Puck Fair is really famous for breaching Irish licensing laws. So the pubs stay open until all hours, until 4 o'clock in the morning. The fair always generates a certain amount of media coverage. In the past, it's usually been just featured as a quirky, lighthearted sort of news story. But in the last decade or so, animal rights activists have staged protests concerning the well-being of the goat up on the stand. And that too has generated a little bit of media coverage. This all came to a head then in the summer of 2022. Pug Fair returned after a 2-year break because of COVID, so that made it newsworthy. And it coincided with what for Ireland was a heat wave. Temperatures reached the high 20s Celsius, and in this country that's quite unusual. So these circumstances allowed animal rights activists to kind of take advantage and to create a media debate about those who were critical of the practice and those who sought to defend it. So that's what I'm looking at. So my research questions are: how is the ritual of King Puck and the goat himself represented in Irish popular media? Who gets to speak for the goat? And what does it tell us about wider relationships between humans and other animals? So I'm doing qualitative research, doing thematic analysis of as much media coverage as I can find of Puck Fair. And what I'm presenting today are preliminary findings from about 60 news sources. Because our theme for this session is discourses of harm, I'm going to focus on the media narrative that's put forward by the organisers of the fair and those who defend the practice of putting the goat up on the stand. Okay. So my findings, as I said, usually we've learned from the literature that usually animals' experiences as real animals, their individuality and their suffering tend to remain invisible in the mass media, but the opposite seems to be the case for the Puck Fair goat. Both the organisers and those critical, they try to speak on the goat in ways that frame him as a distinct individual with a unique personality and identity. They use his correct pronouns, so they kind of recognise his personhood. And organisers are keen to talk about the goat. It's a different goat that's captured for the festival every year. And in interviews in the media, they talk about his unique biographical details, like his colour and his age and his character, his temperament. So both sides describe the goat as an individual and also as a sentient being that's capable of feeling both pleasure and pain. In fact, those who defend the ritual do so by referring to what they imagine are his subjective experiences of the world. So one of the organisers, for example, says, sure, he's used to being up on heights. Don't worry about him being up on the stand. Or a trader at the fair says, don't worry about the goat. He's thick-skinned like myself. So he's actually recognising the shared sentience between humans and other animals. So both sides in the debate appear to try and empathise with the goat, to imagine what it feels like to be him. So the media debate about King Puck wasn't about whether he was an individual animal with subjective experiences of the world or whether he had sentience. It was about what sentience means in terms of his needs and wants. So for those who are critical of the practice, they feel that his potential suffering is both physical and emotional. They imagine that he's very distressed up in the fair. He's not used to being around people. For the organisers, they too express concern for his well-being, but it's always framed exclusively about his physical well-being. So they're keen to stress that he gets enough food and water, that he's regularly checked by a vet, he's vaccinated against disease, and some of them even argue that he's in better physical shape when he's released back into the wild than when he was caught a couple of weeks earlier. So in the media, they repeatedly describe such kindnesses they offer the goat. And of course, this is a way of defending the practice. Maybe we can also see it as what Taylor and Fraser call a neutralization technique. Maybe they're trying to manage sort of conflicting feelings about the importance of the ritual on one hand and their concern for the goat on the other. But either way, what we see is that the media debate about King Puck descends into a discussion about animal welfare, about the ethics, not about the ethics of using animals as entertainment. And this echoes other research that finds that it's almost impossible to break the dominant media narrative and have a real discussion about animal rights. I think looking at it from a sociological view, there might be one more reason why the organisers of Puck Fair are keen to acknowledge that the goat is a sentient individual with his own personality and so on. So you might all be familiar with the work of Tobias Linne on the Swedish dairy industry, where he argues that dairy cows end up performing a type of emotional labour because advertising constructs them as sentient individuals with stereotypically feminine personality traits. And that made me wonder, perhaps by emphasising the individual personality, wants and desires of King Puck, that the organisers of Puck Fair allow him to perform a similar role as symbol of the fair. So the festival is branded as Ireland's oldest fair, and much of the media coverage talks about it being over 400 years old. The origins of the fair and the ritual of the goat are unknown, but organisers frequently link it to Irish resistance against colonialism in the past. One way in which they argue that King Puck is kind of a symbol of Irishness is to say that he stands for all of Ireland, which I presume just means that people come from near and far to represent the fair. But this idea of a male character as a symbol of Irishness is quite unusual. I thought that was interesting because Ireland, sort of traditionally in the culture and the literature of the nationalist movement, Ireland was almost always represented as a female character. Kathleen Houlihan, here she is, sort of a grieving Mother Ireland who's yearning for her lost sons that have either had to emigrate or been executed by colonial forces. But here at Puck Fair and in the media coverage, organisers are really careful to stress the male character and the male gender of the goat. So press coverage calls him strong, wild, and hardy. And he's frequently described as a male goat, a he-goat, or a beast. So these hegemonic masculine qualities are then transferred onto those local men who track, catch, and handle the goat for the duration of the festival. And again, this forms an important part of the media narrative about Puck Fair. So we see celebratory headlines, goat catchers take home a king, and these really dramatic photographs appear in the media that clearly present the men as masculine heroes with almost sort of fairy tale-like masculine traits. These articles also describe the hardships that the men have to endure in order to catch the goat. So in interviews, the goat catchers talk about it being a back-breaking exercise, or the meatiest bad weather and wily goats they have to contend with. One of them says, it took 7 of us to catch him this year, and there was a lot of running involved. So they're clearly representing themselves as tough guys here. So there's a contradiction in the narrative of the Puck Fair organisers, where on the one hand, they describe the goat as happy and content and really well looked after. We don't have to worry about him. But on the other hand, they must portray him as a wild animal that is doing its best to avoid capture. So his very resistance to being caught is a central part to the story they're telling, so that both the goat and his catchers can perform the hegemonic masculinity that grants these men status and power. The hegemonic masculinity of the goat and his catchers are then further reinforced by the fact that since 1948, Puck Fair has also had a queen. She too appears in the media narrative, and because she's only about 11 years of age, I've blurred her faces here in the slides. But you get a sense of what we get to see. So a young girl every year is chosen through an essay competition to perform the role of Queen of Puck Fair. She's dressed in a sort of a faux Celtic gown. She has a crown. She leads the parade with the goat. She reads a speech, and she is the one who then places the crown on the goat's head before he's hoisted to the top of the stand. The girl is never sort of directly sexualized or objectified in the way women often are in the mass media, but she is part of the spectacle nonetheless. She's there to be looked at alongside with the goat. And as you can see, photographers ask her to kiss the goat or to pose alongside him. So I think that her part in the ritual illustrates how the subservience of both women and non-human animals are linked in a patriarchal system. Because as queen, she holds little actual power. Newspapers report on her duties and responsibilities, which include meeting and greeting visitors to the fair. So she's really just a glorified hostess. So also the ritual has changed little in the last 76 years, with no room for individual creativity or for the queen to oppose her own meanings or ideas. At the same time, of course, the Queen of Puck Fair is considerably more empowered than the king, the goat, who remains caged for the duration of the festival. So this is one last thing I want us to think about this morning when it comes to how the media represents the ritual of King Puck, and that's how it all is linked to capitalism. So for the organisers of the festival, of course, it makes economic sense to defend the status quo. The festival is estimated to bring 7 million euros to the town every year. So I want us to think about for a moment, what does it really mean to crown a goat as king? The coronation of a human king or queen is designed to bestow power on them. But for the goat, of course, that's not the case. It's actually disempowering. I think that the coronation of King Puck is a mockery. It's a display of power over him rather than bestowing power onto him. And I would argue that it's a ritual that signifies the ability of humans to do whatever we want with animal bodies. And this point, I think, is really relevant because what Puck Fair actually is a horse fair. While the goat that we hear so much about in the media, while he's suspended up on his platform, hundreds of other animals, especially horses and ponies and donkeys, are bought and sold throughout the 3 days of the festival. But this fact receives hardly any media attention. So in the debate over the concern of the welfare of animals at Puck Fair, nobody attempts to speak for the horses, even during the heat wave. I found one single article in 2022 that mentions both the potential impact on the goat of the heat wave and the fact that Puck Fair is a horse fair. But that article makes no connection whatsoever between those two facts. This article was written by a journalist who attended the fair for the 3 days, and it was published in one of the main newspapers in Ireland, the Irish Examiner. Most of the article describes the trading of live animals in celebratory terms. As you can see here, it's all about how much money was to be made buying and selling horses. The article seamlessly moves on to describe other goods for sale at the fair, including jewelry, baked goods, and I quote, one of the best beef sandwiches that an interviewee had ever tasted, further reinforcing the fact that animal bodies are commodities, ours to consume or profit from. So the literature tells us that media reflect the culture and society from which they arose. And Deborah Merskin has said that when animals are represented in the media, they're there to say something about us humans, not about them. So at the end of the day, Puck Fair is an annual celebration of a rural, social, economic, and cultural system that's firmly rooted in the daily oppression and exploitation of non-human animals. King Puck, the goat, becomes a piece in a wider puzzle, a tool for communicating who we are and what we stand for. And I expect that for the organizers and their supporters, admitting that they were doing harm to the goat would sort of open the floodgates on criticism on wider practices of animal agriculture. So they're not just defending a quaint local tradition or rural Irish identities or ways of life. What they're really defending is a species economic system based on the commodification of animals and their bodies. And as we see, the Irish media seem only too keen to facilitate them to do this and to deliver these discourses of harm. Okay, thank you. And I'd love to hear your questions or your feedback.
So I'm going to present the results for discourse analysis on a very important lobby, Spanish lobby in the industry of animal experimentation. These are some results that belong to a project, the Compass project, that we have been working in for the last 4 years and which is finishing. This is the last year. So I will very shortly give an overlook of the animal experimentation situation today and discuss our findings for this topic in this way, including also in this session, including also the analysis for visuals that we did not include in the previous presentations of this topic, and concluding with our final insights about how we interpret and our theoretical framework for interpreting those results within the human washing theory and the iconographies of oppression. And before going on, I forgot to say thank you to the organizers for this conference and congratulations to the first speakers, Emily and Annette, for these 2 wonderful presentations you have done. So, well, I will be very fast on the presentation of the project, just I have to do it because it's a funded project by the Spanish government, so I'm forced to present always this. But in any case, we have 3 industries of analysis, the 3 major industries exploiting animals, experimentation, entertainment, and food. And we look at how lobbies basically try to hinder the development of compassion for animals in modern society. So here I am presenting the findings for animal experimentation. And well, first, just to remind that we are in a very contradictory and paradoxical field in which there is an increasing concern in society about the welfare, they call it, the treatment of non-human animals in laboratories. There have been a number of actions that show that, but probably the most important one is the fact that the current EU regulation, the directive approved in 2010, it's a regulation that very, very clearly states that the main final goal of the regulation is the total phasing out of animals in laboratories. So including this in a regulation, it's very clear about how the pressure of the concern among citizen society and animal activists has had an impact on regulators and also in the industry. But actually the industry continues its activity as always. And of course, the problems are the same as always. Of course, the major and most important problem is the ethical one, with all those sentient beings in laboratories treated in all those very harmful ways that I'm not going to detail here because you know and I don't have time. But this is not the single problem, because there is also the problem with the scientific approach that this means. The animal model is a model that the industry doesn't discuss, but it has severe problems of translatability. And this is something that it means risks also for humans, for the results of this type of research. Also, there is the fact that the industry exploiting animals in laboratories is a huge industrial complex, so moved by profit. And that means a lot of things, including the fact that they have been putting a lot of barriers in the way that the directive is actually forcing to all of us, which is researching and using alternative methods. And there is also of course, these recurring scandals appearing in newspapers, and I am showing here one that occurred in Spain that maybe you have known about because it was internationally covered also. It was a case that appeared in 2021 in newspapers about a contract research organization in Spain, Vivotecnia, which is a contract company specialized in pharmacology and toxicology tests. And there was a whistleblower working within that uncovered a very wrong handling, they call it, of the animals there, not complying with even the Spanish and European legislation, which is, of course, not the best legislation in the world, even though the final goal of phasing out the legislation is very, very humble, to say it somehow. And they were not complying even to that. And there was very strong images that I'm not going to show you, but in any case, that appeared in The Guardian, in El Diario in Spain, and then in other newspapers. And it was maybe not surprising to read that the CEO of this company, of Vivotecnia, was insisting in that the culture of animal abuse was not happening in its company, in total contradiction with the images we saw and the explanations by the whistleblower. There were huge mobilizations in the country, and a number of political parties and NGOs, well, one political party, a number of NGOs filing complaint against Vivotecnia. The whistleblower, Carlota Saorza, was granted protected witness status, and Vivotecnia is currently facing legal proceedings. But in spite of all that, major Spanish scientific institutions continue to contract this company since June 2021. So that's the state of the question. So what we wanted to do was to look at one of the biggest, if not the biggest, lobby in Spain in the area of animal experimentation, to see how this lobby negotiate this increasing compassion amongst the public and all this bad news that force them to make a public statement and to somehow justify furthermore their activities. You can see in the slide the definition that this lobby provides for themselves, and we have stressed here that they say that they pretend to rationalize and improve the use of the laboratory animal. Here you can see how they are stressing the fact that they acknowledge that they have a problem, because otherwise they wouldn't need to improve the use or to rationalize the use. So also worth to mention that within this big lobby, one of the main benefactor partners is precisely Vivotecnia, the company I have just explained was protagonizing this scandal. So we conducted a multimodal analysis. That means studying text and also visuals at 3 levels to see how this big lobby represented non-human animals used in laboratories, how this lobby represented itself and the industry, and how this lobby represented society as a beneficiary of animal experimentation. We analyzed a number of texts and of pictures and photographies. And first thing to say is that 1/3 of our sample was very clearly devoted to promote animal experimentation, which means it was merely devoted to public relations, in spite of their claims of being a scientific and rationalized and very serious authoritative voice. But 1/3 of the sample was devoted to mere public relations. The sample show strong interest in not only because lobbies, lobbies mostly try to convince and change regulation, convince policymakers and change regulation or avoid regulation, but lobbies also increasingly try to shape public opinion. And in this case, the website by SECAL, by this Spanish lobby, is mostly oriented to influence society and with a strong emphasis in influencing children and young people. And the main argument they have for what they do is that they are essential for science in all those fields you can see here, that I'm not going to read it because it means that they think and they say that they are essential for almost everything. And actually it is. They are essential for almost everything because they have framed research in this way. That doesn't mean that it's necessary this way. So for the representation of non-human animals, of course, the first thing to say is that they are representing in subordinating, commodifying, objectifying language. This reproduction of the human-animal binary is obvious, and we may think that it's not surprising, but it must be stressed that it's essential for the lobby, and it's essential that they do it in a way which makes sense, because otherwise the rest of their arguments make no sense. The rest of their arguments are only more or less rational and understanding if first you acknowledge that humans are superior somehow. So the case for humans deserving more ethical concern and deserving more is very important in all the narrative of this lobby and all the lobbies of animal experimentation in general. Of course, to do so, they need to strip animals of their individuality, and they need to reduce them to mere tools, and that's why they use technical, rational, sanitized language or metonymies, in which the king metonymy of this field, of course, is laboratory animals, as if there are animals who are born to be in laboratories. And also the model idea of animals being a model of humans. And in this case, for the Spanish case, you can see un modelo al lado de los humanos means a model alongside humans, meaning that even they are presented as volunteering, that I will comment later on that. Also very important is the contradictory description of their sentience, because sentience is minimized or suppressed, but sometimes they cannot avoid talking about sentience in this way when they do it. They do it because they want to show concern, ethical concern, but they always do it in a very economistic and utilitarian way, which in the end is forced by them because they are complied to follow what the regulations say about being aware of the sentience of non-human animals and treating them in a less cruel way. So everything is very contradictory because they don't like to acknowledge sentience, but they have to in order to show that they apply the regulation, but they do it in a very tiny way. Well, you see. There is also a lot of contradictions in how they describe non-human animals' agency. They can be described as passive or as compliant or as content or as giving consent or as volunteering and leaving a scientific footprint or as volunteering and even becoming heroes, as you see in the image. And there is a almost total suppression of violence, avoiding images and any textual description of violence. And instead, we find the exploitation of emotional labor, that is using the cuteness or the beauty of non-human animals, of course, not of what they do with them in laboratories, but on they want us to see them. They use it to exploit their activity for profit in digital media, as Lina and Canavan said. And there is, of course, these anthropocentric hierarchies. There are some animals that matter more than others, and that are species, companion animals, mammals, etc. And there are some animals, mostly related to those that matter more than others, that are never shown as test subjects. And mostly they are shown as beneficiaries when they know that the benefits for non-human animals of animal research is only a tiny, tiny percentage of the whole time, efforts, and money devoted in animal experimentation. And finally, there is, and very importantly, there is this cutification of the images, mostly of images of visuals, in mostly the visuals addressed to children and young people, in which we can see happy and proud animals, also proud animals, as in the La Historia de Musi, the history about music, which it's subtitled as the importance of being an animal of laboratory. So trying to foster positive emotional engagement with the public, in this case, the young and children public. Then for the representation of the industry, very quickly, they just show themselves as ethical championing, as the champions of concern about ethics and welfare of non-human animals, presenting themselves even in what we mention as pseudo-care frame. As in these two examples you can see in the images, and note that in the two examples, and mostly in all examples with pseudo-care frames, we have only women, and with the suppression of all sorts of information that contradicts this ethical championing, also portraying themselves as, of course, scientific, but of course as being the authority in the topic. And this is a very important point, because the appeal to authority frame means that they are saying to us, Sharat, you are not experts, leave it to us, the experts, we are the only one who know. And this for instance, the proof by assertion of the animal model, I have mentioned before, the animal model is not even discussed. It's just given as a proof by assertion because we say it, we, the authorities, say it. And we also have identified non-inclusive and sexist language, as in the images I showed you before, showing only women, for instance, for the care in the industry's self-representation. And finally, the emotional framework, like in this example of the visual representation of the milestone rhetoric, the milestone rhetoric being mostly wishful thinking, because most of these so important stages of research have not been really as fruitful as they say they have been. But of course, they don't discuss this wishful thinking, and on top of them, they add those images of the king, the heroes, the volunteering animals that have helped with this milestone rhetoric. And finally, the representation of society is super contradictory. First, they treat all society as supportive, but when then some communities are complaining or are explicitly against animal experimentation, they darkly and only label it as radicals. So if you don't complain, if you are not supportive, you are automatically radical. But at the same time, they mention that the public are easy to manipulate by radicals. So the supportive people are not so strong because they are easily to manipulate. So you see, very, very contradictory. And when they depict the public for children, for instance, you see the happy smiles for children of in the cases that they are informed about animal experimentation, and for the opponents, painted as misinformed, as uncompassionate, even angry people, in contrast to the compassionate and caring industry. So, to conclude, the two main frames that have been studied around so many issues for critical animal studies perfectly apply here. The human washing and the iconographies of oppression. That means that the industry is negotiating compassion in a very instrumentalized way, in a very manufactured way. So they are not really authentic, of course, in their compassion, but rather using compassion with human washing tactics by framing itself as concerned about animal suffering, but at the same time discouraging the cultivation of compassion among the public. And that's it. Thank you so much, and open to questions.